last few minutes, David, of Naftali Bennett, the Prime Minister, and Defense Minister Benny Gantz sitting there in the Parliament plenum, seen consulting with each other, whispering to each other, looking at a telephone. So yeah, obviously they'll have to make some decisions. Look, what Kobi Michael said about Israel's interest in Lebanon makes a lot of sense, right? To leave Hezbollah to its own troubles, to wallow in its own problems with the Lebanese public and all of the economic decline, certainly on the anniversary of the Beirut blast, and to let them have to deal with and take responsibility for the very, very difficult situation in Lebanon. On the other hand, there's a risk there that this gives Hezbollah, maybe through the Palestinian groups, if Hezbollah is not itself directly firing these rockets, a kind of shield to be able to create a new equation in Israel's northern border, similar to the equation in Gaza, where Israel again accepts this drizzle of rocket fire and allows Hezbollah to really affect Hezbollah or the Palestinian factions who have a similar interest in this sense as Hezbollah, to disrupt the lives of those Israeli communities along the border, create a new situation, weaken Israel's strategic standing, weaken the morale of Israeli communities on those border, and be able to put pressure on Israel over time by gradually escalating that activity. So there's a risk for Israel in pursuing that kind of strategy as well. There are no easy decisions here. And certainly there's a lot to be said for a strategy that looks to a longer term, more strategic decline in Hezbollah's standing inside Lebanon. But I think we all have to acknowledge there are risks to that strategy. So certainly not easy decisions for those Israeli decision makers to be making as they consult over a phone in those initial minutes in the Parliament plenum.
And we saw, even as this negotiations were going on to form this government, that the flare-up with Hamas began seemingly as a way to derail, even as maybe a side initiative on their part to derail these types of discussions. Are we seeing more of this, potentially this poking the bear in Israel, seeing how this new government may react? Is this possibly the type of probing test fire coming out of Lebanon, a test for the leadership here? Just how big of a moment is this for the decision makers, for Naftali Bennett, as you mentioned here, already being looked at by the cameras? How's he making these decisions? How's he reacting in these moments? Is it a big moment for them right now?
Well, I mean, a couple of different points. Number one, is it a big moment for the government? Of course, any moment like this is potentially a big moment for the government. Of course, again, we're still assessing the situation. We're still collecting facts. And until we have more of those facts, we won't really be able to have a full handle on how serious the situation is. But certainly any security threat is going to be a serious challenge for the government and for a novice prime minister such as Naftali Bennett. Although, again, David, we should say what we've seen over the past few months in security-related matters is just how strong the Israeli establishment is, the military, the intelligence services, those professionals who advise the government. There's a really strong backbone there, a strong spine that can really guide the leaders if they're surrounded by good people and make level-headed decisions. Don't forget, of course, Benny Gantz is there as defense minister with, at this point, fairly long experience, certainly in terms of Israeli politics in that position, of course, having been the head of the Israeli military before that. As to whether the fact of Israel having a new government is in the heads of those in Lebanon who are making considerations of whether to do that, first of all, we don't know because, again, we're assessing more facts. But my sense is I doubt it. I suspect that they have their own interests and their own objectives vis-a-vis Israel. And those interests and those objectives wouldn't really change much regardless of who's sitting there in the prime minister's office in Jerusalem. They, again, I suspect, might want to create a new equation on the Israeli northern border. Maybe they see an opportunity to do that. And again, it's up to the Israeli decision makers to weigh their decision and decide how to respond.
Thank you, Owen and Jonathan. But we are going back with our guest here, Dr. Kobi Michael, just before we head out for a break here. Now, given the new government, Dr. Michael, in the country, and what we saw is a diplomatic really blitz internationally this last week, getting international support for essentially Israel's cause in the region, certainly against Iran. Do you think we're likely to see more international push following something like this? Is this something that gets brought to world leaders again?
I'm not sure about it. I think that the international community is pretty frustrated with regard to the situation in Lebanon. And I think that the international community as a whole is pretty helplessness. And they don't have a very special interest in Lebanon. This is, unfortunately, will remain an Israeli-Lebanese /Hezbollah/Hamas issue. But I think that we have at least to take into consideration the potential or possible involvement of Saleh al-Arouri, who was elected just recently to be the deputy of Ismail Haniyeh in the last elections in Hamas. And he is also the the elected leader of Hamas in the West Bank. But Salah al-Aruri is very active in South Lebanon.
Michael, we are heading out to a break in just really seconds here, but thank you for being with us so far to break this down. So for now, one rocket hit in the north of Israel. We'll be right back with much more on the situation.
Today we'll be making gondi, a traditional Persian dish. It's a type of meatball made of chicken, chickpea flour, lots of onions and spices. This dish was created by the Jewish Persian community. Most non-Jewish Persians aren't even familiar with it. You can find gondi in every special event celebrated by Persian Jews. Sabbath dinner, for example, wouldn't be Sabbath dinner without it. I migrated to Israel in 1977, before the Iranian Revolution. I brought my love for cooking with me. I learned how to cook traditional food from my parents, and this love inspired me to open my own restaurant in Tel Aviv. One of the largest Persian communities in Israel is situated in the area of Novinsky Market in Tel Aviv. Many of them own spice shops where they sell things like spices, lentils, and Persian rice. Without these authentic products, I couldn't run a real Persian kitchen. The combination of spices reflects the flavors of authentic Persian cuisine. Cardamom is the most dominant spice along with cumin. It's almost impossible to separate myself from my roots and my identity. I'm proud to be Persian and cook food that people love. I think these days Persian food is some of the best in the world.